Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Makita Brottmann about Guilty Creatures. Welcome, Makita.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
Oh, I'm very happy for you to be here too. Before we started recording, I told Makita that I'm going to read a couple of sentences from the last paragraph of the book because I think it really talked to me. It says, "A murder is a crash at the intersection of two lives, splitting them open at the seams, laying them bare for analysis and speculation. We don't want to admit that people who commit murder are just like the rest of us, but there is no rest of us. There is just us." And that struck me so hard because I think that just as the characters in your book want to sort of differentiate themselves from others, I think we humans, as maybe as a protective measure, we try to think, well, those are people are over there. Is that something you would agree with?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of ambivalent about most true crime in general, because most true crime kind of pits people like the villains and the perpetrators and the prosecutors, or the victims and the perpetrators, and doesn't really kind of question those categories, and it's almost like a good versus evil kind of thing, without sort of questioning, well, you know, who is a perpetrator? Where do they come from? What was their upbringing like? The same with a victim. You know, victims aren't pure and angelic as they're often represented in the media. I mean, there's like a continuum between the two, and sometimes a perpetrator can be a victim and vice versa. So I just, and then, yeah, people tend to think about also, you know, psychopaths or narcissists or people out there who do terrible things that we would never do, rather than accepting that, again, we're all people. You know, I say this in the book. I think under certain circumstances, we all have a capacity to commit terrible crimes. So yes, and it's a distancing device. We want to separate ourselves from them. And also by doing that, I think it's a way of like repressing the fact that maybe at some level we do identify with them.
I agree with you. So the subtext on this cover, which is just so wonderful, I love the fact that I'm assuming this is sort of representative of the Holiday Inn sign, which I love. This is a sign I saw a lot growing up, but it says "Sex, God, and Murder in Tallahassee, Florida." Thank God for Florida, because it constantly gives us good stories, from the Florida man to the Florida woman to just all kinds of crazy things that go on in Florida. How did Florida become a character for you in this writing?
Well, like you said, Florida's a big state. It's a hot state. There's a lot of really interesting cases that go on in Florida, strange cases. But also, I think one of the reasons why there's so much reference in the media to true crime in Florida and these Florida man stories is partly because of the liberal public access laws in Florida, that it's very easy to file, you know, Freedom of Information Act requests, and these sunshine laws that allow liberal public access to discovery materials in court cases and court transcripts and so on. I mean, you know, it still can be expensive to get hold of them, and you can get hold of them in other states. It's just that Florida makes it easier for the public to get access to those kinds of materials. So I think partly the number of crimes we hear about in Florida might be kind of disproportionate. But you know, I start the book by saying that when early adventurers, discoverers came to Florida, like John Muir, they wrote about how the sense of like how beautiful it was, the heat and the fauna and the flora but they also talked about how there was like the heat and the humidity. They were afraid it might foster this sense of like lassitude and maybe sort of moral relaxation that the states don't encourage. And I don't know if that's true or not, but there is something, you know, I guess the more south you get, the hotter you get, the more relaxed people get, and maybe there's something to that sense of relaxation is also a kind of spiritual or moral relaxation too.
Well, it very well could be, so Florida for years was always billed as the untamed jungle. And there is a lot of that. I mean, alligators are known to roam through people's backyard and eat your animals if you're not careful. And it is something that is a part of Florida. And I do think the heat is a big thing because it makes people very passionate for good or bad, because the heat is very different in Florida. It's very warm most all year long. I mean, it makes it the perfect vacation destination. So give the audience an overview of what Guilty Creatures is about, because I started at the end. Now we should get into the meat of what this is about.
Okay, well, I think a lot of people in Florida might have heard of this case, and it has got other media attention, but I'll just summarize it. So it's in Tallahassee. You have two couples who've known each other for a really long time. Brian and Kathy Winchester and Mike and Denise Williams. They married. I mean, they knew each other from high school and preschool, actually, grew up together. Very small Baptist community. The two couples marry. They both have a child. And then what happens then is sort of a kind of releasing of these strictures. They start to question their faith. They start to wonder about why there are these so many restrictions on their moral behavior. And they kind of let loose sexually and experiment with, threesomes and strippers and drugs and alcohol. And after a while, Kathy and Mike decide that they've had enough. They want to have children. They want to go back to their previous way of life. But Brian and Denise haven't, and they start to have an affair. And again, it's a very kind of sordid sexual affair. Again, within this small Baptist community, they manage to get away with it. And then they start to think about ways in which they can, quote unquote, be together. And this leads to, rather than thinking about divorce, which would cross most people's minds, they start to think about ways that they can get rid of Mike. And it's really, baffling that someone would think that murder is preferable to divorce. But again, in this very small community where you've been brought up in strict Baptist faith, so that they actually posit it as a test. It's not going to be a murder. It's like an accident. So Brian will push Mike in the lake. They're both avid duck hunters. Mike's wearing waders. Brian assumes his waders will fill up with water and he'll drown. So Brian goes out in the lake, comes back. Everyone assumes Mike has drowned. And after that, Brian and Denise get married. And, later on in the book, at the end of the book, I explain what actually happened to Mike. And it wasn't a drowning at all. It was a horrible, horrible murder. Everything went wrong. And but what interests me isn't so much the lurid details of the murder, of what happened to Brian and Denise after they married. It was another 16 years before the murder was revealed. So how did that couple live? How did they, because they re-embraced the church. So how did they go to church every Sunday, kneel, read the Bible, take part in religious activities in the community, knowing that they had murdered Denise's first husband? So that's really what interests me, as well as, the details of the crime, but how people repress things. And it seems like Denise almost repressed it to such an extent that she actually came to believe that she didn't do it. Well, so finally it's revealed Brian and Denise turn on each other. Brian tries to kidnap Denise. It's very dramatic. Denise goes to the police, and Brian's arrested. And the community has sort of known what's happened all along. Mike's mother, Cheryl, is a sort of driving force, and she's never let this drop. She's always been putting up missing posters, writing to the press, writing to the governor, hoping to appoint a special prosecutor. And so eventually a journalist at the Tallahassee Democrat, Jennifer Portman, came to help Cheryl in her search. And the community kind of sort of realized or suspected heavily what had happened. So finally, Brian gets into police custody. The police say they're going to ask for a life sentence for this armed kidnapping. Brian makes a deal with them, tells them what happened to Mike in exchange for immunity for that crime. Eventually, he got a 20-year sentence for the armed kidnapping. So then Denise is tried for the conspiracy to commit murder. and she has a 30-year sentence as well. So Brian and Denise are both in prison now. But like I said, I mean, it's not just a kind of average true crime case. It's the time it took that interests me, and what happens psychologically to the characters during that time.
I totally agree. So at one place, Denise is sort of, someone says that divorce would ruin her social reputation. And I really thought a lot about that because I grew up in a very strict Baptist environment growing up. And as I tell people, you know, as a gay man, I could hide in plain sight as long as you participated in church. If you sang or acted or did whatever that you needed to do, but you actually participated. Church is a funny place. It is a place that a lot of people hide. So Denise and Brian sort of hiding in plain sight isn't surprising to me because I find that in our quest to be different than other people, a lot of religious people say, here in our little church bubble, we're all going to heaven and we're all connected. And all the people on the outside are destined probably for hell or need help. So we should turn our back on them. I was one thing that broke my heart was Cheryl saying how she had, you know, she was always trying to get information out there. She was trying to get help from the police and all, and that the church sort of turned their back on her. And that to me was like, here is a perfect opportunity to help a grieving mother try to get some closure. And what do? You freeze her out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true about what you say about the hiding in plain sight. But I should also add that during research for this book, I spent a lot of time, you know, at Baptist services and talking to Baptists, and they were just, you know, without exception, the kindest, gentlest, you know, most polite, understanding, kind people I've ever met. So it's not individuals, it's the institution, I think, that breeds repression, not individuals. And you're right. There's a lot of hypocrisy in the institution, in all institutions, I think. And with Cheryl, one of the things that people were suspicious of is that she went to church, but she's also interested. I mean, she kept this journal of her quest for clues about Mike's murder. And she was also interested in things like omens and, you know, consulting psychics. And she left no stone unturned, but the church felt that those avenues of exploration are sacrilegious, I guess. And because she got her information from unusual spiritual sources, she was sort of cast out and seen as eccentric by the Baptist community.
That
and
is
yeah,
something.
That's a great opportunity that the crime could have been solved long ago if people had listened to Cheryl.
I totally agree. And, you know, one of the things that I always found unusual about religion and spirituality is, so religion says that if you go and see a psychic or you do things that are alternative, that there's something wrong with that. I say, well, what if God speaks to this psychic? Why is it just the male minister standing in the pulpit is the only person that can tell you what God thinks? Why can't someone else tell you what God thinks? And that's one of the issues I have as an adult saying going to what I would call a strict church is because I'm like, you know, I might want to explore other options or other opportunities. It doesn't mean that I don't believe in God. I think I'm evolved enough that I know that God speaks to many different people at different times. So why would I shut the door on something that potentially could help me in the long run?
Right. And in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, God manifests himself in all kinds of ways. But the other thing about Baptist community, as opposed to like the Catholic community or other Protestant religions, is this idea of like your relationship with God is not mediated through a priest or a higher authority, that you yourself can get messages from God and pray directly to God. And so it's difficult. I mean, I think Brian and Denise wanted to be together so much that they told themselves that this must be what God wants. And so confused, like sort of stretched their religion to fit the murder. So I guess they were sort of confusing their own sexual drive, their own need, their own desire with a voice from God speaking to them. And if God speaks to you directly, you can kind of make him say whatever you want, really.
Absolutely. Because there's one, you know, when Mike goes out with Brian into the lake, it's, well, if it's God's will, Mike will live. But that's not what they did. They helped God with the will. So it wasn't as if he really had a chance. And of course, when people read this book, they're going to find out, as you say, it wasn't a simple drowning. It was something far worse than that. And that is, I think that was yet another proof that they weren't waiting on God's will. They were helping God with the will.
Right. And it makes no sense at all because, yes, if there was some kind of miracle and Mike survived, that would show that God did not want them to be together. But what if that happened? I mean, Mike survived. His best friend has just tried to kill him. What's going to happen then? I mean, how could they go back to having a relationship with his friend? You know, it makes absolutely no sense at all. And obviously, they had no expectation that Mike was going to survive. This was just a way of making the crime acceptable to themselves, you know, mentally and spiritually.
That's right. And I do think, though, that is one of the things that, as I read from your last paragraph of the book, you know, there is no rest of us. There's just all of us. We all do things in our everyday life, you know, to help promote ourselves. And that's, I mean, that's the human nature. But here are two people who've decided that they can reinvent the truth for themselves. And that's when it becomes delusional.
Right. And you're right. I mean, one of the things that interested me so much about this case is, like, psychologically, we see our own, in this case, we see our own behavior writ large. You know, we all repress things. We all keep secrets from each other. We all go through a process of denial and self-denial. So when we see it on this larger scale, is in a one way, it's easier to distance ourselves from it, but it's also, we distance ourselves because we acknowledge that we have these impulses too. And one of the other things that interested me about this case is that it has all these parallels with classical literature, like Macbeth. You know, Macbeth and his wife go through exactly the same situation. They kill someone for their own benefit, and then it comes back to haunt them, and they sort of pass the burden of guilt from one to the other. So these stories are kind of blueprints or templates for the way that we do behave, you know, all of us. It's not just criminals or people in stories.
So I want to ask your opinion on sentencing. So I noticed sort of a unique thing that when it comes to women, if it's a mother and a child, the sentencing is usually very lenient. And what I'm thinking of is Susan Smith, who drove her two children into a lake. She got a very light sentence. But when it comes to a woman and a lover, or a woman and a husband, I find sentences usually run a lot longer. Is that something you would agree with?
Yeah, and I talk about this in the last chapter. Whenever you have a situation like this, where there's a couple get together and kill the wife's husband or the husband's wife, it's always the woman that's blamed much more than the man. And it's usually almost always the man that actually carries out the act. But the woman is not only sentenced sometimes more strictly, more seriously than the male, but she's also kind of sex shamed at the same time. And that's not something you get in cases with mothers and children. There isn't that kind of, like in this case, it was sort of assumed that Brian was a weakling and Denise lured him into her web. And in fact, her sentencing was more severe than his. Brian got complete immunity for his part in the murder, so he wasn't sentenced at all for his involvement in the murder. And Denise's defense attorney called this the Eve factor. It kind of goes back to Adam and Eve, that the woman is always seen as more responsible than the male, even if she didn't actually pull the trigger.
And I find that is such a strange position for humanity to have come to, because it's like, in this, I mean, I don't know where I fall seriously and whether I think Denise is 100% culpable for what happened or not, because I find that the person pulling the trigger is the person who really has the power. And that's one of those things that I know in Brian's defense, he says she got in his mind. I'm like, but that's an easy thing to say. You're grown. Get her out of your mind. But that's easier said than done. So this poses so many questions to make me think about, you know, where would I fit in that lane? What is my responsibility? How would I react? I know one of the jurors likened it to CSI. And I'm like, this is the last case I would ever want to be on a jury for. It would not excite me or thrill me. It would haunt me, and I would not want to be involved in it. But then not everyone feels that way. Some people are like, yep, I would love to be on that jury.
Yeah. And I think the jurors actually said that, of course, they took the case very seriously, but they also judged Denise on her kind of stoicism in court, that she seemed cold. She didn't seem to express any emotion when Brian was confessing. And if she was telling the truth, and this is the first time she would have heard about what happened to her husband, and that she had married the man who murdered her previous husband, and the fact that she seemed cold and unemotional during the testimony, I mean, that's not a reason to judge someone. People have very different ways of showing emotion, and she might have already been told the story. She might have been given Valium. She might have been trying to be stoical for for her daughters, or for the sake of people in the courtroom. I mean, people react very, very differently to emotional situations.
Totally agree. And I'm glad I wasn't involved. Again, the wonderful book is Guilty Creatures. It's by Makita Brottmann. Makita, do you have a website or social media you'd like to share?
Yeah, my website is just my name. So it's makitabrottmann.com.
Perfect. That's straightforward enough. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Out with Dan.
Well, thank you for having me. It was delightful.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.